with the rain. Thank the good Lord for the rain. Ellis, would you say a prayer over this crowd, please, sir? Thanks, sir. We've got a couple of bills. We're not going to do one of them. Brian, would you take a half a second and tell us what a good job y'all did and everybody enjoyed the peanuts yesterday?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We owe all the credit to this committee as well as the Senate Ag Committee. Yesterday, many of y'all participated in this room and certainly on the committee, the peanut power hour on the second floor of the Capitol. The idea there was certainly just to draw media attention to the products that are still in the marketplace. And we know that Representative Levinas had a lot of good television time, as well as Senator Bullock and others. On radio, we received phone calls, emails from television broadcasts, as well as radio and print ads in the papers all across the state, just talking about the Georgia products that are out there from our peanut industry folks. And we just thank y'all. We thank y'all for the support you've shown publicly, as well as certainly around the committee room tables. And it was a great event for the industry, and that was what was key to the Georgia Agribusiness Council. And it works when we all work together. And we appreciate Commissioner Irvin coming by, and I know he had some good comments on the media as well. So all around good event, and we appreciate all the support.
Thank you, Brian. Thank all y'all for participating. We are honored to have the distinguished chairman of the Senate Ag Committee, who got his learning in the House. So, Representative Bullock, if you would. Look, John, sit down right there and cut that mic on so the TV thing will work, and we can get you on record. This ain't y'all, but that's what we got to do.
Tell you what, Lenmore, I wished I didn't ever see another microphone or television camera. If anybody else wants this, they can have it. Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate you allowing me to present this piece of legislation. And before I do that, I'd like to thank Gary Black and Brian Toller and Georgia Agribusiness Council for what they did yesterday. And even though he wants to give our committees a lot of credit, and our members did participate, but the legwork and all the work didn't come, or maybe you did, Mr. Chairman, but I didn't do anything, so other than show up. So, Brian, we want to really thank you for what you did, and Gary. So, SB 43, very simple bill, and this is a boll weevil trap. For those of you who might not know what a boll weevil trap looks like, but when we look at the success of this program and what it's meant to the economy of the state of Georgia, and especially to the agricultural industry, that boll weevils wiped out the cotton industry in the state of Georgia and the United States back in the 30s. And when the boll weevil eradication program was initiated and Georgia participated in it, and the General Assembly appropriated funds to get it started, and then the growers themselves were assessed on a per acre basis to fund the cost of the continued boll weevil eradication program. And in the original bill, it had in that the boll weevil eradication board could collect an assessment on a per acre or per bale basis. And under the per bale basis, the bill on page 1, item 4.1, code section, title 2, article 5, chapter 7, that the first buyer is what the original law said. And in today's market, most of the cotton is purchased through brokers Those brokers are all over the country, and we don't need to have somebody from another state having responsibility to collect if the board has to go to a per bale assessment. And the reason that we're trying to change this and get it in place is that the USDA FSA office is looking at not they're who collected on a per acre basis today, and they want to get out of that collection process. So what we've done is we've changed it from first buyer to first handler, and instead of first who buys cotton, it's who owns and operates a gin where the cotton is first delivered. And that's the only thing we're changing in the law, is that part about who the first handler is and definition of handler. And what the bill does is just, in the Cotton Ginners Association, Southeastern Cotton Ginners Association, Georgia Division has written a letter in support of this, and they don't mind undertaking it. They're already taking an assessment out for the Georgia Cotton Commission, and so that it'd be handled the same way they do that. Be glad to try to answer any questions.
Got any questions? Do we got a motion? Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I'm personally glad to be a comment for years. I was wanting to try to get something like this approved. We've lost a lot of money over the years from farmers who trying to beat the system. And I've known some personally who owe tens of thousands of dollars at the same time I'm paying the tens of thousands of dollars. And this way here, nobody can get by. So I commend you for bringing the bill. I commend the committee for taking this bill up, because I tried to get one through so many years ago, and we were not letting a lot of come through the bill. So it's a real good bill for those who know more things like assessment and things like that. So
Okay, I finna ask you if you want to do that. Is there a second? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thank you, sir. I got to tell y'all one thing. I ran a boll weevil program back in the 80s, and we were catching so many when this thing first started. We were having to check those traps twice a week because they'd fill a little cylinder up. And we had a guy from APHIS, which is Animal Plant Health Inspection Service Federal, come and give us a demonstration on. They were filling the traps up until they were escaping. The live weevils were. So we started putting kill strips in them. And the genius from the federal government was showing us how to put the kill strips in, and he said at the same time we were putting the poison in there, don't cover up the vent holes because the boll weevils might smother. And it's a wonder this program did good as it is, so with APHIS running it. But anyway, thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. They hadn't caught a live boll weevil in the state of Georgia in 6 years, so the program's working. But we got to continue to monitor it. And
you know, we used to spray stuff. I've seen birds drop before they get out of the field with some of the stuff we used to spray, and for boll weevil.
It's a great program, and
right.
The amount of pesticides that's used in the boll weevil, in the cotton industry today is so much less, and our environment so much better off. Representative Ellis Black will be carrying this if that's okay with you, Mr.
That's
Chairman.
fine with Tom.
I think we need to make a point about rate reduction in pesticides that this brought about. This is about the environment.
Senator Oldsbury, North DeKalb, too.
I appreciate the chairman of the North DeKalb Agricultural Association bringing that up. That's right, a real word.
For y'all that don't understand, the only thing a boll weevil can reproduce on is a cotton plant until you get down into South Texas and Mexico, and that's why it's so easy to eradicate. So anyway, thank you, John.
Thank you, sir.
The other bill we need to talk about today is continue some talk on House Bill 263. Representative Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you again on HB 263. I'll give you a quick little background for some of you who may not have been here in the last committee hearing. This is a bill that was brought forth by a constituent of mine, and Miss Amy Scott, who was here last week with us and would have been here this morning but had a sick child and sends her regrets and sorry that she couldn't be here because she wanted to be here. An incident that happened with her where she hired a home cleaning service, was told that they had done a background check on the employees. The particular employee of the home cleaning service came back to her home and in the guise of employment or trying to use the phone while he was in the neighborhood and brutally assaulted and raped the nanny of my constituent while the 3-year-old daughter was in the home. And that is a result of, that's the motivation behind this bill, which would require a background check on any employee or any provider of an in-home service, and would prohibit someone who had been convicted of the 7 deadly sins as well as a couple of other key felony convictions from performing an in-home service or having an employee that's been convicted of those felony counts from providing an in-home service. We got lots of feedback from the committee, and we appreciate that last time, and we've got lots of feedback from different folks in the community throughout the state, and so I wanted to bring to your attention some changes that we made in the bill. We did, and we're going to have 3 amendments to the bill that I'll go through as well that we weren't able to get done before final printing. But if you'll read in line 14, we defined criminal background check made it a little tighter, and we would propose that we add an amendment in line 15, if you'll follow with me, that would read, starting in line 14, criminal background check means a check of a person's history of criminal convictions in this state, and then strike out and any other state, and then put in obtained from the Georgia Crime Information Center. There was concern that when we were asking folks to do a background check that they were done over the internet or some services that maybe weren't as reliable, and so we zeroed in on that the background check would have to be obtained from the Georgia Crime Information Center. There are some concerns about the Georgia Crime Information Center information as well too, but I thought I went online to do it to see how simple it was, and actually went online to do a search on Representative Kevin Levitas because I figured of this committee he would probably be the most likely to have a felony, and for privacy purposes I'm not going to disclose the results of the felony search, but yeah. And it took me about 1 minute. It cost me $15, and the search was pretty thorough. And so that's what would be required of employers to perform the background check on the employees that provide an in-home service. 1 minute, $15. That's how much it costs. The other change the other amendment that we would also add is in line 18, where it reads, in-home service means any commercial service, and then we would insert, comma, for profit, offered or provided to the public, which requires a person providing such service to enter residence. There was some concern, a valid concern brought up by folks that we would start requiring background checks on pastors that would go into a home to provide counseling, to Meals on Wheels folks who were going in to provide meals, and that was not the intent of the bill. The intent of the bill was to deal with commercial vendors, and so we've basically eliminated through this change. Both these changes recommended through Wayne, our able counselor, that would make sure that nonprofit is not included in this bill. A couple other changes that we made since last time that are in the bill. If you were licensed, if you were in a profession that required a background check for purpose of licensure, you're exempt from this. For instance, the real estate brokers who go into homes now came to us and said, hey, as part of our licensure process, we take a background check. And so therefore, if it's if you're required to take a background check to be licensed, you would be exempt under this proposal as well too. You've basically already done the background check. We also added language that would, if you had already obtained a background check as a process of your employment, and therefore you wouldn't be required, or your employer would not be required to have to go back and do another background check. For instance, I think Home Depot was one of the folks that came and approached us and said they do background checks on all their employees, so therefore they would not be required to, if a background check had already been obtained, would not have to go back and do it again. We also added 2 other items to the list of felonies. We added we had aggravated child molestation. We added child molestation and enticing a child for indecent purposes as a result of some feedback we got from the committee last time as well. And then finally, there was some concern about how would you handle the Avons and the Pampered Chefs and the folks like that were direct sellers, sole proprietors, if you will, that didn't have employees, that were on their own. And the question was, well, would you have to do a background check on yourself? Well, no. The way we're changing it is the prohibition against performing an in-home service would apply to anyone who had a conviction of the 7 deadly sins and the other felony convictions as well too. So it avoided some of the confusion of would you have to do a background check on yourself? Well, if you're convicted of those felonies, you just would be prohibited from performing an in-home service. Now, again, the motivation behind this entire bill was to protect our citizens from folks that would do harm, and that's the sole motivation behind it. And I would value any further input from the committee, and would appreciate a favorable consideration at the appropriate time. That's possible.
One more thing we need to change. Y'all will
Oh, yes, sir.
932.
Yes, sir.
392 is more than talking about campground employee or campground personnel.
That's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you pointing that out. Also, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks, Wayne. If we do the amendment where it's only obtained from the GCIC, I think, Wayne, help me correct, in lines 44 and 51, we would strike out "or another state," because the GCIC, my understanding, only searches for felony convictions inside the state of Georgia. Yes, sir, Wayne.
Mr. Chairman, if I might make a suggestion on the GCIC question, if you could go back to line 15 and not only strike out "in any other state," but also strike out "in this state," and that would just allow whatever GCIC can provide you, they'll provide you.
Okay.
Same thing on lines 44 and 50 and 51, you strike out "under the laws of this state or another state." On line 44 and line 51, "under the laws of this state or another state."
Anybody on the committee have any questions or either Alan or the law director that knows what to do?
Mr. Chairman,
Let me get y'all.
that's fine. I just
Yes, sir.
Remember we discussed here, you and I, about the gentleman at Kansas, that he had a felony 19 years previous. It says under 10 years, they have to have it if they OT 10 years, I believe. And it was exempt. What happens on the people that have been it that may over 10 years? It's free of charge.
Dr. Maddox, we had discussions with folks about that, and I'm willing to entertain looking at that as we continue to vet the bill. It just at this time, there was some concern on both sides that while we should give some credence to those that have been rehabilitated, it was just not at this time the intent to do that, and so.
He was concerned it's been 19 years since he had his colony, he was a teenager, sort of foolish, and he was clean.
Yes, sir. You know, the interesting thing is the gentleman, his name was Roddy, who came, the crime that he was convicted of, I chatted with him afterwards, would not have been under the felony convictions in this bill. That's yes, sir. He would be he would not come under the jurisdiction of this bill.
Representative Peake, again, you know how much I'm fully in support of your bill, and I'm going to actually make what I hope is a friendly opposition, which is my concern with limiting it to GCIC is twofold. Number one, there's usually a long delay in making those kind of requests, and if commercial background checks are okay for any other business, that's what I use. I use a commercial service. I don't use GCIC. I would suggest to you that's good enough for in-home service. They don't need to be treated any differently than any other commercial enterprise, and we ought to, for their sake, make it easy to be able to run that background check. And I'll do whatever the sponsor wants, but my suggestion would be to leave it as is and not limit it to GCIC and allow these commercial background checks. As you know, as an employer, when we get a report that shows some kind of negative report, we have to, by law, give that to the employee who has an opportunity, if it's not correct, to contest that record. But I think it's going to put a little bit more burden than you probably intend on the employer to have to wait on all those GCIC backgrounds. And it's just, like I said, it's friendly opposition. Whatever the sponsor wants to do, I'll support. But that would be one recommendation I have.
I tell you, Representative Viz, I appreciate that. My concern was that exact same thing. That, I mean, again, the intent is to get the bad guys, and if we limit it to just the state, there may be somebody who's committed a crime in Florida or Mississippi or Alabama that we may be missing. So I'll defer to the discretion of the committee, and would not be opposed to not including that amendment in there.
That would be my recommendation. Also, the other question, and because I'm just not as familiar with the topic as you are, I appreciate you're not trying to. I mean, there may be some folks who might feel differently, but I appreciate you're not wanting to maybe touch clergy or other folks, or as you said, the Avon lady or the Tupperware person. But are there not-for-profit companies that provide in-home services that we might want to be concerned about? In other words, just happens to provide the same service, but they're not doing it for profit, like one of those groups that was here today? Because what if they come into we wouldn't be requiring probably the folks we want the most to have that background check. In other words, these are like the Justice Project where you've got convicted felons. They would be exempt because they're a non-profit corporation. So that would be my concern with limiting it for profit. Again, something's better than nothing, but again, by way of friendly opposition, I'm not so sure that we might not want to exempt certain people but leave it for profit and not for profit, or say provided, however, such shall not include, or have something that includes these nonprofits whose specific purpose is to hire people with felony backgrounds, because I would want them to disclose that.
Again, Representative, I think that's a good suggestion. My concern was if we got into list, the list would go on forever, and so that's why we felt like we were safe in, and again, going with the intent of the bill is protection of our citizens and excluding the nonprofits as a group at this time.
I mean, I guess I would say that's one I think we ought to put back in. Any nonprofit corporation founded on the principle of hiring convicted felons ought to have to run that background. So we've got to make some changes anyway to the bill. Mm-hmm. That would be, again, my suggestion. Because I think at the end, if we put it for profit, that may actually defeat one of the purposes that you had in bringing this bill. Because if the Justice Project, and I'm not singling them out, they just happen to have testified, but if they hire somebody with one of the 7 deadly sins, they would be exempt from the statute where Coolray wouldn't be. So I would like to see if council can maybe include language that would capture the folks whose nonprofits whose specific purpose is to have felons. And the last thing, Mr. Chairman, I promise this will be my last one. I just want to throw this out for the committee. I know you and I have talked about this offline. There was one suggestion made by members of the business community that rather than make an out-and-out prohibition, that there be a specific disclosure that says if you have somebody convicted of these 7 deadly sins, and my suggestion would be it has to name the exact offense, not just we run background checks or there's a felony conviction, but to make it the HVAC company or anybody else that walks in with their employee, they have to disclose, and it has to I would say it has to be both written and oral notice to them that the person entering their home has been convicted of whatever the offense is, and then let that person decide. Obviously, most people, I hope, are not going to let somebody who's convicted of aggravated child molestation into their house with kids. But in other words, it would be up to the consumer, and the thought of the businesses was, if you're excluding these folks, it's a prohibition. Maybe the free market ought to decide. And again, I don't have an opinion particularly one way or the other, but I just throw that out there for the committee's consideration, because you and I have already talked about that.
We did. I chatted with legislative counsel about that exact issue, and we were having a hard time coming to grips with how we put it in language and make it practical as well too. You know, does employer tell the customer, okay, you have to sign a document that says that you acknowledge, you know, that you don't want this particular employee who's been convicted of a felon to come into your home. So we're having a hard time coming to grips. Good idea, I think, in theory, but we were just having a difficult time getting it in language. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Peake, I think that you understand that all members of the committee want to do something to redress this terrible incident. Something that I'm concerned about, whereas Comcast, as an example, says that it doesn't affect them because all of their people who go out to the homes are independent contractors, so they're not going to have to do this. Is that correct?
No, ma'am. It would. The prohibition is against anyone who goes inside the home. So the prohibition would be if you have an employee, but it also if you perform the service, if you are an independent contractor, if you are a sole proprietor, you would be prohibited from performing an in-home service if you had a conviction of any of the 7 deadly sins. So
then what you're telling me, just so that I'm clear, is that if Comcast is going to come out to service your cable lines, that they have had to do a background check on that technician.
If they have an independent contractor, if they've hired a third-party independent contractor, the independent contractor is prohibited not by the employer, but by the legislation.
So the contractor would have to do the background check.
Well, the contractor, if he had an employee, would be required to perform a background check on an employee, or if it was a sole proprietor that was in business by himself, he or she would be prohibited from performing an in-home service according to this legislation.
All right, he would be prohibited, but who would he tell?
Well,
so that could be a hidden thing.
There is potential, but I mean, we were trying to figure out how to get around it.
Right.
The prohibition is
right. He's committing another crime.
Or any individual. That's correct.
All right, I understand that, but for instance, something like AT&T is concerned about this because of the numbers of people that they would have to perform background checks on. Because they don't have independent contractors, they have employees. So that there's a real imbalance there.
Well, there could be, Representative Dooley, but I've chatted with AT&T folks. They have, and I've communicated with them extensively throughout this. They already perform background checks on their employees that go inside their home. So they would be exempt if a background check had already been performed.
So this wouldn't be an additional.
That's correct. If they've already performed a background check on an employee that works for them currently, they would not have to go do it again.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
One last question, Representative Peake. On just a plumber that you call for just a few minutes, who comes in, got a leak, water leak, stopped up a commode or whatever, they have to have a check, even if they're family owned, etc.?
Yes, sir. And this kind of goes to the same question, Representative Dooley. That if they perform an in-home service, according to this legislation, they would be prohibited from performing. They would be prohibited from performing an in-home service if that sole proprietor or that family businessman, on his own, had been convicted of the 7 deadly sins. Yes, sir. They would be.
No conviction, okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. We were trying to get around to make sure that they don't have to perform a background check on themselves, and so. Yes, sir.
I see on line 53. I guess this is where the remedies or what you would be guilty of if you don't do this.
That's correct.
I'm a contractor, not a lawyer. In contractor's term, what does that mean?
Well, the violations, the remedies for the violations would be either fines or civil lawsuits. So, if you were a contractor on your own, as you are,
I am.
and you were convicted of a felony of the 7 deadly sins.
I'm more concerned with my employees.
Because I'm assuming you're not. I can do a background check on you in a minute if we need to, only for $15. I'm assuming there are no felony convictions on your records. But if you had an employee that had, and you hired them, and didn't perform the background check and sent them to a home and they performed an in-home service and it was discovered, you would be subject to fines and subject to litigation for civil lawsuit.
What are the fines? Are they listed here, or
they are not? And I don't know if Wayne can help me out. I don't know
The
that.
first step would be a cease and desist order,
Okay.
and then if you violate a term of injunction, cease and desist order, the civil penalty is up to $25,000 for violation.
So it's pretty substantial.
so I have to stop working?
You would have to cease and desist from allowing that employee to go and provide in-home service.
Okay.
And Representative, if I can, again, the way the bill is written, it would only preclude them performing in-home service. If you were coming over to my Cheddar's to do some work, fix my roof, or go inside, do some remodeling of my restaurant, they would not be prohibited from going inside there and doing work. It would just be just inside a residential home.
I guess my basic concern is I inherited my father's customers, and he did home repair and maintenance, and they're 80, 90 years old. They called me, and it cost me more money to do it than I received, but they sent me through college, so I'm kind of indebted. I guess the civil penalties now, so it exposes me to civil litigation, so that means I can be sued.
That's correct, yes, sir.
Can you imagine the impact that this bill is going to have on the small plumber, the HVAC contractor, the electrician, who are much smaller, me, I'm talking about them, me, who are much smaller businesses than I am, and they have to track all of their 1 or 2 people coming and going. I understand where you're trying to go, but on the very small business owners in our communities, they don't hardly, they got too much paperwork as it is.
Representative, if I can respond.
Yes, sir.
Keep in mind, this is only for folks that perform an in-home service, the plumbers, electricians, all those vendors.
They do.
They only have to perform the background check one time. It takes 1 minute, and it's $15. They only have to do that one time. If their employees have not been convicted of any of those 7 deadly sins, there's no issues. And I would tell you that, yes, there may be an additional burden on some small businesses to do this, but the benefit to the citizens of our state, who would never, ever have to go through the horror that my constituent went through, is worth the small cost.
Mr. Representative, I do understand what you're saying, and I feel for your constituent. But do you think it might be and I applaud what you do, don't get me wrong, but do you think every business has to bear the responsibility of the unrighteous acts of one person in this state? One person, one bad apple now makes every plumber in Hayhira, Georgia stop what he's doing. Well, it's close to home, you know. In Newton, Georgia, in Hopeful, Georgia, where I'm from.
In Macon, Georgia.
Yeah. But every one of them now got to stop because of the unrighteous act of one person. That's
Again, Representative Dukes, it's a all the requirement is a quick background check, and if they're not convicted of any of those felonies, no.
Does anyone in here other than me might and a possibility to have to do in-home service? So it don't sound like much to you because you don't have to do it. You got to do it too. Does it sound like much to you?
I mean, something needs to follow.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm just.
Yeah.
I was just going to comment, Representative, I don't want you to leave here under the misrepresentation that you couldn't be sued now. Right. And that's one of my issues with it. I brought up in the last committee meeting is that there are some remedies at law now. I mean, it's a tort, negligent hiring, negligent supervision. And in this woman's case, I'd asked her the question directly about what action had been taken against the employer. She said that he had been sued and felt like his insurance, she thought his insurance was paid out, and I'd be willing to bet it was policy limit for that that's committed by his employee. So you can be sued now. And we've had some good discussion today about one of the problems that I thought, and as I know you recognize yourself, is the scope of this. When we're trying to, like Representative Levitas also concerned to me about trying to, I mean, I understand what you're trying to do, and I know your heart's in the right place with trying to exempt the nonprofit, but I'm like you, I struggle with language of how, on the cuff of how to actually exempt people when the intent is actually protection of our citizens. I mean, if we got a bill that passes out, and Representative Levitas suggested maybe some language exempting nonprofits who are founded on hiring felons. But in the event, and even if you do that, that nonprofit group, heaven forbid, that nonprofit group that heaven forbid hires a felon, and they were exempted from the bill, and they go in and do something like this, then I don't know how much protection we've offered them. So I got a couple of concerns. Still, I got a scope issue, and the other is, there may be adequate remedies at law for this already.
Okay. Chairman McCall, could I? If it is the will of the committee to not address those two amendments, I'm fine with that, and will defer to the wisdom of the committee, and therefore there would only be one amendment, which would be the one on line 25, just clarifying the code section number. But I'll leave that discretion to the wisdom of the committee.
We have a couple more questions, and then I'm sure there's probably some folks in the audience sign up cheaply if you waive out.
At the proper time, I'd like to make a motion.
Thank you.
And I'm for one who is certainly opposed to any criminal doing anything in one sense. But now my concern about this bill here, though, is are we trying to correct one problem and causing several other problems? That's not really what we do. When we start exempting certain groups, allowing other groups to go in and these transactions and everything else. And my thing is, I think we need to focus our energies on the problems of the road, on courts and things like that to correct this problem instead of trying to solve the problem here and create a problem over there. I think that's what it is.
Anybody else have?
Did I understand you say that the self-employed person is exempt from having to do a background check on himself?
That's correct. The prohibition would still apply to them if obviously if they knew they were convicted of a felon,
Okay. What sort of situation are you creating where a person is a convicted murderer, been out, served his time,
Yes,
and his friend calls him, wants to go on FMP, something in his home?
if he would be, as long as he was a convicted felon of those 7 deadly sins, he would be prohibited from providing a commercial service to his friend in the home.
Is that what you want? I mean, he gets less if you want it for free.
If he did it for free, then sure. I mean, he could do that. He would have to provide a commercial service in home. Representative Black, I understand. I see where you're going, and I understand that. I don't think it would, again, if you were the convicted felon, it doesn't preclude you from going and helping your friend add a porch on his house. But if his friend's going to pay you for services, then yes, you would be precluded from providing that in-home service if you were in the home. Again, what the intent of this bill is to stop the bad guys from going inside. When people...
I don't think anyone has any question at all about the intent of that crime. I see unintended consequences. You also have not included anything here about making it happen for owners of where a company sends unsupervised. And you've got people in the construction business that have folks on their payroll that's been with them for years and they've got records. And maybe their normal course of business is not in-home service. And I'm particularly thinking about contractors that build homes, build new homes. But all of a sudden, just like right now, these guys they'll do anything they can to try to pay some driving agents. Somebody wants to remodel work, they're going to go do some remodeling. And you won't be tracking.
There is provision, Representative Black, in here that if the employee has been with the company for over 10 years, that they would be exempt from the prohibition. So there is some remedy for folks who have been with an employee for a long time and prove that they're trustworthy and so forth. So.
Representative Pete, under this bill, if, let's say that I had a friend who was in prison, convicted of one of the 7 deadly sins, he got out. And I had a project, he had no work, good friend of mine, but I had a project for him to do around my house. I'd be prohibited from hiring him to do it under this piece of legislation.
If he was coming inside your home, yes, sir.
Correct. I would be prohibited.
He would be prohibited from performing the service.
Even though I knew up front that this guy was a convicted felon of one of the 7 deadly sins.
That's correct. As long as he came inside your home.
Okay.
They got about the question around the committee. Anybody in the audience want to make a comment? Yes, ma'am. You walk up and tell us your name, please, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Marissa McCall Dotson. I'm a staff attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Georgia Justice Project. And I first want to say to Representative Peake how appreciative we are of him and his work. He's taken a lot of time in listening to us, our concerns and our issues, and several of them he addressed and actually made amendments to his bill on. So we first want to say thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, in terms of the GCIC requirement that the criminal records be requested and disseminated by the Georgia Crime Information Center, 2 things. First thing is on the GCIC, it will tell you whether or not someone is a multi-state offender. So it won't be able to pull up the crimes, but at least you'll be able to see on there that it'll tell you that this person is a multi-state offender, which will lead you to maybe make a more searching inquiry. The second thing is GCIC has its problems in and of itself that actually our agency is working on rectifying as far as their accuracy and completeness of their records, but they are a much better as a centralized body, the body that's responsible for disseminating records in the state of Georgia by Georgia law, they are actually much better than your commercial background checks, and here's why. On the front of every commercial background check that you pull, it says, we cannot verify the truth and accuracy of this information. Now, I understand the concern that you can always go and say, challenge it and say, this record isn't me, or this, I want to challenge this record. But let's be realistic here. If you're dealing with someone who the employer pulled a background check for, and it comes up and says they were committed of 5 felonies, and they have someone else who they pulled a background check for, and it has no felonies on it, do you think that the person who the employer is going to say, let me give you opportunity to come back and show me how this is incorrect? That's not happening, and I see this every day. Employers are not telling people, please tell me, I'll hold this spot for you in this position so that you can show me why all these felonies on your record are incorrect. So I just want to make sure that we understand that I see this all the time. I'm in part responsible for our Coming Home initiative, which is dealing with reentry in Georgia, and that is a big issue. We have enough issues with GCIC, but commercial background checks are just in a terrible state as far as their inaccuracies. And that was something that I voiced to Representative Peake, and I'm so glad that he considered it for his bill. The second thing is, the way that I understand it, Georgia Justice Project was mentioned as far as our landscaping company and our nonprofit, and how agencies who hire ex-offenders should be required under this bill to make these same steps. The way that I understand it, though, Georgia Justice Project and our landscaping business is not affected by this bill. We do not do in-home services. Our business is specifically landscaping. So even under the auspices of Georgia Justice Project and our commitment to hiring ex-offenders that go through our program, they are not considered, we're already exempt because we don't do in-home service. So I wanted to make that clear as well. I also would implore that we do look at a rehabilitation period, and I don't know that I heard him say that if you've been with the business 10 years, then you are exempt from this prohibition. But I would say that after a certain amount of time, and I would be willing to discuss this with anybody who will listen to me, but after a certain time period, we have to realize that in order for someone to be a productive and contributing member of society, that at some level we have to be able to say, we can trust you again. You've taken steps in your life and steps in your community. It's been 5 years, 10 years, however many years. You haven't committed a felony. You haven't committed any crimes. We should be able to take the chance on you. And we should be able to say, we shouldn't continue to punish you for something that you did 10, 15 years ago. You should be able to have opportunities available to you. And so those are the 3 things that I think that I definitely needed to speak about, and I'd be happy to answer questions if you have them.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By and large, was I understanding you correct to say that you really didn't have a problem with it because your program is exempt?
No, I wanted to say that our landscaping, the part of our program that deals with hiring ex-offenders at this point,
is a landscaping company that's, and my question is, if you've got somebody's convicted of aggravated child molestation that's pruning the bushes out by the curb outside of somebody's home, is the danger, would you think the danger was, or the risk was as similar to that if that person, of doing harm to somebody, as the same as if that person was going in home to take the dishwasher out?
Well, see, I can appreciate where you're coming from on that, but I don't. Let me put it to another way. My particular problem, our particular problem with the bill is our clients, the people that we serve, we're upfront in disclosing that what we do, and that we're actually helping people rebuild their lives. So it's not a secret that people that we have working for us are ex-offenders. So my issue with the bill is not necessarily disclosure, and I think that addresses the risk issue, because if I'm telling you that I, as an employer, that I hire ex-offenders and I give them opportunity and I give them a second chance, and you as the customer say, I understand that and I'm willing to help them change their life around, there's an understanding of the risk. Now, if someone is
No, what I'm saying is, and it goes back to my scope issue again, I'm just as concerned for my wife and my son about the guy that's coming in to repair the dishwasher as I am the guy that's out on the sidewalk trimming the bushes.
But what difference? I mean, I guess how far? That's a slippery slope. That's how
Absolutely.
Far
That's
then you're in the
my
parking
point.
lot. Now you're in the. Yeah.
That's my point.
Right. So I guess I would err on the side with you and say that at some point you're going to get all the way to, you know, people who work in grocery stores and people who work in the parking lot and people who work, you know, I have a problem with the bill as in home services for a different reason, for different reasons, and I don't think that applies to our landscaping company as far as the bill.
I mean, I appreciate the bill, and the representative is a good friend of mine, and I'm, you know, willing to work with him and want to try to figure out how we can get this scope. And I think Representative Levitas shares the same thoughts about getting the scope narrowed down.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, maybe by way of comment more than a question, if an employer, and I run these commercial background checks I do it on every one of my employees, everyone, because I don't want somebody that's ripping me off who's been convicted of credit card theft, so that's me. But if I fail to disclose that information, if I fail to give the opportunity to that person, I have violated the law, and you have a cause of action against me. So if that's not happening, and that employee has chosen not to pursue his or her rights, or your organization has chosen not to pursue that, that's up to you. But the remedy is there in law. It is a requirement that if there's an adverse employment decision either made or considered, the employer must provide that record, and that person has an opportunity to correct. And I guess what I'm not willing to do, and I'm trying to be as sensitive to what I'm hearing from Representative Dukes, you're going to make a much harder requirement. It's going to delay the time when Representative Dukes wants to hire somebody. If they have to go through GCIC as opposed to a commercially available search, you're going to put an undue burden that's not imposed on any other business on these folks if you don't allow them to do a commercial background. So I will just tell you, I don't intend to offer that amendment. I don't know if anybody else on the committee does. But again, what we're after, and I've said this if you were at the other hearing, if it's a balancing test and I have to make a mistake on one side, you better believe I'm going to make the mistake on protecting Representative Maddox, his wife, and his daughter, or my family, over somebody who wants to get a job. Now, I said at the beginning of the hearing, and I'm certainly open to this, and I'm sensing from the committee maybe that's where we're headed, is rather than an out-and-out prohibition, to having an absolute full disclosure and allowing, if it's Representative Roberts wants to allow that person into his home, as long as there's full disclosure of the specific offense, aggravated child molestation, I think that but that said, we would eliminate that there's some kind of 10-year or 20-year safe harbor. It's up to me as a homeowner to decide if the fact that you were convicted 11 years ago of aggravated child molestation is enough for me. I don't have a problem with the free market deciding. Maybe that's the compromise that we can all come to. But I certainly think that organizations, this is not an indictment against your organization at all. I think what you're doing is good. Rehabilitating offenders is a great thing. But y'all absolutely, and organizations like you, absolutely need to be covered by this statute, in my opinion.
Okay. I appreciate what you said, and I just want to make a couple of comments. The first thing is, the way that you request GCICs is, I don't believe, is an undue burden. And Representative Peake just said that he completed one and did it in less than a minute. So it's not. What takes GCIC requests more time is when a nonprofit or a law enforcement agency requests them free of charge. There's a longer window. But if you are up front and paying that $15 fee, it's as quick as if you went on, USIS and requested your criminal history. I would also say that in your situation, you pulling commercial background checks on every employee is discretionary for you. This bill requires that it's a mandate. So you choosing to use a commercial business or commercial enterprise to pull your criminal histories is different, in my opinion, than mandating that people pull criminal histories. And therein lies my issue with the accuracy of the records. And that's why I'm saying, if you're going to make a mandate on that they pull criminal histories, let's at least make sure that the record that they're getting is accurate and complete.
Well, and I've heard you say that GCIC isn't accurate either. Again, I think it's if we're going to try to lessen the burden on the folks who are affected by the statute, why on earth would we not leave it up to them to decide how they want to run their backgrounds?
because I think that at some level we need to protect the people, the potential employees as well, and I think that is where the balance is. I agree with you wholeheartedly that there needs to be a balance here, and I don't think and back to your point about disclosure versus prohibition. If it's disclosure, and we're talking about only disclosure, and if the employer and the customer consent and say, I know this person's been convicted of aggravated assault, I realize it was 12 years ago or 13 years ago, and I'm willing to take a chance, I'm all for that. My issue with the time period is the prohibition, is that you can't be hired or work if you committed the 7 deadlies plus 3 or 4 or wherever we are with that right now. I'm happy that you were able to at least hear me out, and I don't want you to think that I'm being combative, and I appreciate you all giving us an opportunity to come in and speak, and like I said, Representative Peake taking his time out of his schedule to listen to us and our concerns. I just wanted to address a couple of things with you guys today.
Well, I was ready to make a motion, but then Representative Roberts brought out something that I've got a question about. If I knew that someone had committed one of these sins, and I still want to hire them to come into my house and to form maybe a domestic worker, I would be prohibited from doing that if I knew it.
Yeah. Prohibition would go to the individual. The individual would be prohibited from performing the service. But yeah, the practical reality is that's
But
correct.
if I knew it and I wanted to, maybe somebody who
That's correct.
Right.
I would be prohibited personally from doing it. It was my own house.
That's correct. Representative Houston, Chairman Call, I'll be more than glad, and I again.
You see where I'm coming from? Because you know, and I know we've all known some women who were abused years ago, and
Took care of it.
took care of it, and then later on, might want to come to work.
Well, what she's referring to, I'll just mention the penny as well. We had someone who kept our children when they were small who had murdered her husband, but he had beat her so severely enough times. She finally, you hate that, and it's a pretty hard situation, but she killed him. Mm-hmm. Now, that part of her life, was pretty tough, but she was things in her life evolved where that happened. But you have, unfortunately, that situation happened more than it should. And knowing that it happened and decided to still have someone do the help is one thing. Prohibiting them from ever being able to do it is another. And I guess that's the line that...
Like Representative Roberts, if I wanted to say it's all right, it's my house, I ought to be able to do it.
Let me, Chairman Call, if I can. I appreciate the patience of the committee for the second time here, and it's a good process for me as well. That's why we do this. We vet these bills to make sure there are not unintended consequences, and that's what I want to happen as well too. I appreciate the comments, and what I'd like to propose, Chairman Call, if you would allow me the tolerance of working with legal counsel to look at some type of disclosure provision in the bill that would deal with this potential issue that has been raised, and maybe come back to you again at your next committee hearing. If
I was going to suggest that if y'all will look at Rule 9, we meet regular on Wednesdays, but we can call meetings. So, we still have time, and I'm afraid your bill might not pass if we called it today. If you want to try to work on it a little more, and
I would
closer.
I would like to do that if the chairman would allow it. And again, I appreciate the input. And I hope the members of the committee see where the intent is. That we don't want to prohibit individual freedoms for people to decide who they want to bring in their home, but we do want to protect innocent citizens who assume that people that come in their home to provide an in-home service that they can trust the folks that are coming into their home, and that's the full intent of the bill. So.
Please let her know that you do want to do something.
Winfrey?
The concern that was voiced earlier, and you're saying that already currently into law, that if an employer sends an employee into a home, and that this employee goes in and do something that is not what they should do, that already in the law that there are remedies. Is that what was I led to understand that?
That's correct. There's potential for civil action against the employer.
Is the potential any different here than it was there?
Well, there are fines added. The prohibition is put in there, so that hopefully there's a preventive measure. And I guess my argument to you, Representative Dukes, would be this lady that endured this horror her nanny received a financial settlement. And I guarantee you, if she went back, she'd give all that money back if she knew that this event was ever prevented from happening, because the employer would have been not allowed to hire that individual. So while, yes, there are civil potential remedies now, what this does is help possibly prevent that from ever happening.
Given that as an argument, well, they hire them anyway. Then the same remedies exist.
There's potential that they could violate the law. That's correct.
Okay.
Let me ask one question.
To follow up on that,
On line 53, where it talks about the violation and what y'all just talked about, at what point in time is it after the fact of a crime being committed, then you figure out who did it?
I think that's, well, there could potentially, let's say somebody came to your home, performed a service, and didn't commit a crime against you or your family, but somehow you found out that this employee was a convicted felon. You could report that business, and then they would be subject to the cease and desist or the fines at that point. So, again, a lot of the motivation is just the prevention of it.
I want to make one comment. The difference here is, and I said this at the hearing, what amount of money would have compensated Ms. Scott for what she went through? What we're trying to do, I believe what Representative Peake's trying to do, is prevent that from ever happening. So having some kind of civil action is not going to prevent this from happening. That's an after the fact. But and I appreciate Representative Peake willing to work on this. I think what I'm hearing from Representative Dukes, Representative Roberts, Representative Houston is if we can get to a point maybe where it's a disclosure, I think the committee sounds to me like they'd be much more favorably disposed to pass this bill.
Again, I appreciate the wisdom of the committee. That's what I'm here for, and here to learn and listen and get good things. So thank you. I appreciate it. I have learned more than you know.
Well, in a lot of communities that are smaller, you know the circumstances, and you have that choice to elect. The disclosure, I think everybody could probably find consensus on. The prohibited, knowing the circumstances around, I mean, aggravated, that would be stabbing, it'd be another number of other things that would be prohibited the way the bill's drawn out. Knowing that happened is a different thing in making the choice to do it.